Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. All we have left for Week 9 is Monday Night Football, which is Arizona at Dallas, so let's look into it. And just going through the highlights of the rankings, you have Arizona pretty middle of the road on everything, except for notably their scoring ranks a little lower, so they have a little harder time scoring, and they have a harder time stopping the pass, especially tight ends. However, they're the best in the league at using their tight end. For Dallas, you have a pretty good team offensively across the board, with the number 2 scoring rank, number 1 passing rank, number 6 rushing rank, and number 11 tight end rank. However, their defense is about the worst in the league. So they're worst at stopping anybody at passing and the worst at stopping anybody from rushing in the league. They're a little better against tight ends than how bad they are generally at stopping the pass. And they're pretty bad at stopping their opponents from scoring. And then here's your averages that match up to those rankings. And then we'll get into the individual players, starting with the quarterbacks, with Kyler Murray and Dak Prescott. Kyler Murray averages 5.5 fantasy points per game, and Dak Prescott averages 19.2. Kyler's had 3 passing interceptions this season and lost 1 fumble. Dak Prescott has had 5 interceptions this season and no other turnovers. Here's those season averages, as well as their breakdowns if you need them. And then just looking at the carry share, you have Kyler Murray with 16.86% of the team's total carries, and it's much more spread out with a lot more people. They've had a lot more injuries concerning their running backs too, so that probably explains some of this. With the Cowboys, you have Dak Prescott with a number that doesn't show up, unfortunately, but I think that's about 13 or 14%. I think we'll get to see that with the running backs when they come up. With the running backs, you have Bam Knight and Javonte Williams. Bam Knight averaging 6.2 fantasy points per game, and Javonte averaging 18.6. The only turnover between them two comes from Javonte with a rushing fumble, and I'll move over to their averages. And if we look at their team carry share, you have Bam Knight with 16.8%, which I think is actually ironically the exact same as Kyler Murray's. You also have Trey Benson here getting a whole bunch, and James Conner still has 18.6%, even though he's been out for a while, so that's why this one's much more spread out. Over here with Javonte, he gets 64, almost 65% of the team's total carries. So he doesn't have much that he shares with. He gets almost all the carries. Getting into the receivers, you have Marvin Harrison Jr. and CeeDee Lamb. Harrison has averaged 10.8 fantasy points per game this season, and CeeDee Lamb has averaged 18.7. With no turnovers, we'll just flip over to their averages, and then look at their breakdowns, where Marvin Harrison Jr. gets 26% of the team's total receiving yards. I think he's just short of Trey McBride, which would make sense because they're the number 1 team in how they use their tight ends. And over here, you have CeeDee Lamb with 18.9, almost 19% of the team's total receiving share. He's a little short, I think, of George Pickens here, but that's because he's missed quite a few weeks, so he's kind of been playing catch-up. Your second receivers are Michael Wilson and George Pickens. Wilson's averaged just under 5 fantasy points per game this season, and George Pickens has averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game. Again, no turnovers between the two, so we'll just look at their averages and their breakdowns, as well as their percentages, where you have Michael Wilson getting about 9% of the team's total receiving share. And over here, as I said before, with Pickens getting 32% of the team's total share. A lot of that coming because CeeDee Lamb was out for a few weeks, and you can see that with these numbers up in here. Wrapping up with the tight ends, you have Trey McBride and Jake Ferguson. McBride averages 16.1 fantasy points per game, and Jake Ferguson has averaged 15 fantasy points per game. Once again, no turnovers between the two tight ends here, so we'll just look at their averages and their breakdown, where you have McBride getting 27.7% of the team's total receiving share. And over here with Jake Ferguson, he's a lot more average, I think, for tight ends, where he gets about 15.6% of the team's total receiving share. So there's your individual breakdown. I think that, it would seem like Dallas should have this game pretty handily against a defense that's about average, maybe a little subpar. One of the best offenses over here. However, Arizona could give them a run for their money if they just score more, since this defense can't stop anything, it looks like. One other fun thing to note that I forgot is that they are the number 1 fantasy team, still scoring the highest average of all the teams in the league. But yeah, we'll just have to see how this game plays out. So there's your Monday Night Football pregame review. I hope that you enjoyed and you got something out of it. If you did, leave a like and subscribe, and leave a comment on what else you might want to see in the future. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you for the next week of games.